Winkles have round, closed shells which roll about in the moving tide without harm. And whelks, with their long siphon, can take in fresh water as they move through sand and mud. Many shellfish multiply by just releasing their sperm and eggs into the sea, but whelks must first pair before laying their eggs in elaborate egg cases cemented to a rock. Out of the eggs, tiny, complete young whelks will emerge. The smaller dog whelk feeds on other shellfish. It can bore a hole right through their shell. The razor shell is perfectly designed for the job of digging itself in. The razor forces its foot through the soft sand and then inflates it like a balloon, only with blood instead of air. This gives it a firm foothold. It can then contract the foot and pull the shell down. Razors can bury themselves in a foot or two of sand in a few seconds. When a razor is feeding, the top of the shell is left sticking up just above the sand. Through it, tiny microscopic organisms are filtered from the sea. A filter system is also used by the queen scallops. When the shell is in the feeding position, you can see a heavy curtain which controls the amount of water going in and out. These are eyes, 35 to 40 of them, all round, in 2 lines. It's very useful to be able to see in all directions, especially when an enemy may be lurking nearby. The starfish is one of the greatest enemies of the shellfish. It hunts its victim by creeping along the bottom on its hundreds of feet. The feet are really tubes filled with liquid rather like seawater, and they're all connected with each other by water channels which run along each arm of the starfish. At the end of each foot, you can see there's a tiny disc, and each of these acts as a sucker, which helps the starfish to attach itself firmly to stones and rocks, or of course any shellfish that happens to be lying in its path. And at the end of each arm there are other tube feet that can't be drawn in, and which act as feelers. It's approaching one of its favorite foods, a mussel. The mussel can't move very fast, and its shell, which is its natural protection, can be forced open by the starfish. The mussel is held firmly by means of the tube feet on the arms of the starfish. The starfish pulls, and eventually the mussel gets tired. As soon as the shells part, the starfish turns its own stomach inside out and digests the flesh of the mussel externally. Some 3 hours later, and the starfish has finished. The pouting move in to finish off the scraps. Strangely enough, empty shells don't always remain that way. The hermit crab often makes his home in one of them. Later, the starfish moves on, and now it's approaching a colony of queen scallops, or queens. But these aren't such easy prey as the mussels. The queens have a very successful escape movement. The starfish goes on trying. If it can only get one arm clamped to the top shell of a queen, there'll be little chance of escape. At one time, fishermen, in trying to protect the oyster beds, used to trawl up as many starfish as they could. They chopped them into little pieces and threw them back into the sea. Unfortunately, they didn't know that as long as each bit had a part of the central disc of the starfish, it would grow new arms and become a complete starfish again. And so the fishermen were busy multiplying rather than reducing the numbers. how clumsy the starfish seems compared with the swift, graceful movements of these scallops. We know that queens migrate because they're not necessarily found in the same area all the year round, but we don't really know how far they can move at a time. Eventually, a queen is trapped. We know now that shellfish are not as helpless as they might appear. They can protect themselves from being buffeted by the changing tide, and they can often escape capture by their enemies. But in winter, there is another hazard which is more dangerous still. A heavy storm is brewing. Rough seas pound the beaches and batter the rocks. Out in the bay, great water movements bring up large numbers of shellfish, tearing them from the seabed, hurling them towards the coast, and splintering them against the sea walls. And when the storm eventually dies down and the water has receded, millions of shells are left abandoned on the beaches, some empty, some smashed, some with the occupants still inside, but frozen by the bitter frosts, stranded and dying. These large cockles normally live on a sandy bank out in the bay, below the tide mark, but the violence of the storm has swept them up and thrown them onto the beach. Now the sea has receded, and they'll die in these freezing conditions before the tide can reach them again. They lie struggling in long banks 5 feet wide, and in some places 2 feet deep. These are the red-nosed cockles. Not really noses, of course, but feet. Here and there, a cockle rives its long foot, manipulating its shell over the backs of other dying animals, searching for a way back to the sandy bottom and the shelter of the sea. At first, the storm prevented the seagulls from hunting for food, and there were no fishing boats going out, so they couldn't scavenge off the deck or the quayside. But then, as the rough seas continued to throw up large numbers of shellfish on the shore, the gulls found they had a plentiful supply of food on hand. The beach is soon covered by an enormous variety of seagulls: herring gulls, black-headed gulls, common gulls, black-backed gulls, all kinds. Here are some herring gulls. And black-headed gulls in their winter plumage. A greater black-backed. Normally, a gull has difficulty in dealing with an intact shellfish, and it has to fly up with it and drop it on the rocks to break it open. But many of the shells had already been smashed by the force of the sea, and so their work was done for them. In winter, with the temperature often below freezing point, any kind of fish thrown up by the sea is soon frozen solid on the shore. Here's a young herring gull trying to deal with a wrasse. It's so hard it might have come straight out of the deep freeze. Yet, despite the great upheaval, out there in the bay, millions of shellfish have been able to survive the violence of the storm. And even among the victims on the beach, there is some justice. One starfish at least that won't be feared by the shellfish anymore. By the time you return for your summer holiday, the seashore is already a happier place. Successive tides have swept the beach, and now it takes a little searching